Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank TEDx for having me here. In the next 20 minutes that I have, I'm going to try to talk about the federal budget. And I know when you talk about the federal budget, it's a pretty long, drawn-out process, but I'm going to try to finish this presentation within 17 minutes or so. And so we have some technical difficulties here. We'll go ahead and get this set up here. I teach 740 students in one of my classes in Centennial Hall, and my other class is a lot smaller, 730 students in that class. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the federal budget only on the spending side and not on the tax side. That may come up in another TEDx presentation. But Mark Twain once said this about lies. There are lies, there are darn lies, and then there are statistics. And so I'm going to give you a lot of statistics on the federal budget in the short period of time that we have. And so, but I want to give you first a historical perspective of the federal budget on the spending side. If you look here in 2000 to 2001, we actually had a budget surplus. How many of you in the audience remember that budget surplus that we had? And we were talking about taking that budget surplus and paying down the debt, or taking part of that budget surplus and trying to shore up Social Security. And then 9/11 happens, and you can tell that we went into a deficit. Red numbers tend to be bad, and black numbers tend to be good. And when you look at this, we have the good, the bad, and then the really bad. But when we talk about this, you have talking heads on television talking about whose fault is it? Well, I'm going to take my hearing aids out. Because what we really want to talk, boy, I can barely hear myself now. What we really want to talk about is the budget itself and where can we go going forward. So we're not going to put the blame on anybody today. And so I am going to put this budget in perspective and put some zeros behind these numbers here. When you looked at this is in billions of dollars. And so we were running this budget surplus, 9/11 occurs, and then obviously the housing crisis in 2008, 2007 causes the other problem going forward. And so what we have is the good, the bad, and the really bad. And so what I'd like to do is really talk about some good things that are happening. Even during all these terrible times that we've been having, the economy was growing, except for obviously in the worst of this great recession, the economy actually shrunk during this time. Now, usually economics is forward-looking and history is backwards-looking. And so we are going to look forward to what is possibly going to happen in the future. But before we do that, we're going to take a look at the federal budget and what they print, okay? The 2003 budget, and that's just the budget itself, had 232 pages. And then they have historical tables, which 2013 it was 368 pages. And then some analytical perspectives, which is 510, and then the appendix. So in about about 17 minutes, I'm going to talk about the 2,582 pages, okay, that are in this budget. And so the first thing we're going to look at is what's called mandatory versus discretionary spending. Mandatory means you can't touch it. It's going to grow, but you can change the laws, okay, that relate to mandatory spending. But it's just going to happen out there. And so all the arguments you hear, you know, Democrats, Republicans, all the different parties that are out there, they're really only talking about discretionary spending at this point. Okay, so what I did is I took the federal budget and I broke it down into the categories in which there is government spending. But inside the books, it's not in this order. I put it in this order because I started in 2004 looking at the budget, and I went from the highest expenditures all the way down to the lowest expenditures by the federal government. Now, a lot of people think that the national defense has been the largest expenditure on the federal budget, But Social Security actually took over national defense in 1992. So Social Security is the largest expenditure in the federal budget. But what I want to do is look at what's called mandatory spending. So what I did is I put the numbers up there that are considered to be mandatory. So you have Social Security, income security, welfare, food stamps, and so forth. And this net interest, if you look at this net interest, the net interest really hasn't changed all that much. And the reason being is inflation has been relatively tame and interest rates have remained relatively low. Now, I do see that as a possible problem later on if interest rates start to climb. But when we look at this mandatory spending, we're looking at about 67 to 70% of the budget, depending on which year you're looking at, goes to mandatory spending, okay? So what the Democrats, the Republicans, and so forth, what they're looking at is all the other types of spending, the discretionary type of spending. Now, why has this spending, if you look at this, why has this spending grown so much? Well, one of the reasons is if you look at Social Security and Medicare, we have the baby boomers now, as they're starting to retire, they're starting to tap into Social Security and Medicare. And so you have this large increase going on from 2004 to 2013 in both of those areas. Now, healthcare costs also have been growing, which obviously forces a challenge on both Medicare and Medicaid. Medicaid is inside the health. But what I see going forward is this. I see a problem occurring in our economy, and I believe it's going to become a structural problem, and that is the older generation versus the younger generation. When I asked my class in Centennial Hall, all 1,400 students, how many of you believe that you will have Social Security when you retire? Not one of the students raised their hands. And yet they already know that they're going to have to pay for it. Well, when they're actually paying for it year after year after year and not expecting anything out of it, there will be a mild uprising among the youth unless something is changed here. And so when you look at this mandatory spending, if I said Social Security, where does it go? Does it go to the older group or the younger group? The payout. The payout obviously goes to the older group. And then also in Medicare, you have to be 65 years of age. And so when you look at this, and especially if you look at this year, if you look at the expenditures, it's quite a large portion of the outlays of the federal government, okay? But what we want to do is look at now what's called discretionary spending, the spending that Congress has some discretion over, and what are they possibly going to do? And so I'm going to go ahead and take the mandatory spending out of this equation here, okay? So when you look at these numbers here, obviously the largest discretionary spending is right here, and that is the military. But all of this other spending that occurs that they all talk about and we've heard about for the last few years has been in this area of the budget here, a rather small area. Now, my dad was a businessman, and he always told me when you're looking at big numbers, try to bring it down to smaller numbers. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a lot of these zeros off the board here, okay? And so what we're looking at is discretionary spending, and again, this is in billions of dollars. We're looking at a very small, if taking defense spending out, we're looking at a very small percentage of the budget that we hear all the noise about on television, okay? Now, this happened yesterday. If you've been reading the papers, picked up the Wall Street Journal or today's Arizona Daily Star, they may have a budget deal, hopefully by Friday before they go on vacation again, okay? But there's even talk in the paper today about possibly doing this to federal pensions. So now you're talking about pensions here, about the old people, that number one, they may cut some of the benefits from federal pensions, but on the flip side, they may also then raise the contributions that the people who are currently working, raise those contributions for the people who are currently working. So we got some challenges going forward with this budget. But I think really the challenge has been this. Do we want fiscal responsibility or do we want growth? And the obvious answer is we would like to have both, okay? But sometimes you can't have both. But I think if it's done correctly, you can have both in this situation. So let me talk first about fiscal responsibility and how this economy works. First off, if you can remember these numbers the rest of your life, you'll know most of macroeconomics. If you can remember 5, 2, 3, okay? 5 is an unemployment rate, 2 is an inflation rate, and 3 is an economic growth rate. Now, I have to tell you, these are very, very conservative numbers. That if we can get unemployment of 5%, we're always going to have people who are unemployed, people who quit their job, go out looking for another one. But one of the things that is beginning to change is this term called structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is when the jobs are actually lost in the economy because the jobs have become obsolete. Or, this is where we're going to get more structural unemployment, where the skill level of the worker doesn't match the skill of the job, that the skill level of the worker is higher than that of the job itself that's out there. And we're getting a bigger population out there who is college educated and trying to find jobs in their field, and there aren't those jobs out there. So let me give you the numbers that are a little more liberal if you want to. What I did is I tried to have you memorize these numbers because 5 unemployment, if you take the 2 and the 3, it adds the 5. It's just easy to remember. But probably the numbers that you should really go by as far as what's happening in this economy, because we are going to probably have more structural unemployment here, is probably 6-3-3. 6% unemployment, 3% inflation, and 2% real GDP growth. Now, the only reason I picked on this earlier slide, the only reason I picked 2 is that is what the Federal Reserve targets as the inflation rate. If that rate gets above 2%, the Federal Reserve will go into action. But they only go into action at 2% because they don't want it to keep rising and get us some sort of higher inflation all the way to possibly hyperinflation, which we don't see in the foreseeable future. Okay? So let me give you this flash document on what I've done with inflation here. Okay? So let me just go back one and then. Okay. This has been the historical perspective of inflation from and unemployment from 1999 to 2013. Now, I want to point out that usually unemployment and inflation go in opposite directions. In other words, if the unemployment rate goes down, if you look at this, unemployment rate goes down, inflation goes up. The reason being is if unemployment goes down, that means we have more jobs out there. People have more disposable money in their pocket. And what do you think people do with most of the money in their pocket? They go out and consume, okay, to stimulate the economy, which drives up prices. But if you look here during our challenging time here, as unemployment got greater, consumers held on to more of their money. And they tucked it away and they started to save. So even though we went through a bad economy here, people began to save a little bit more of their income. So they go in opposite directions, but I want to point out a good thing that's beginning to happen, and that is this right here. Just within the last couple days, if you see the unemployment numbers, unemployment finally got to 7%. Boy, that's the lowest we've seen in quite a long time here. And if you notice, inflation is also going down. They're heading in the same direction. But there's lots of reasons for this. America is more productive now, but they were getting more productive with hiring fewer workers. So let me give you just a quick example of what's happening in the business cycle. Now, what I have here, and I'm going to teach something that I teach my class in about 3 weeks. I'm going to teach you in about 3 minutes here, okay? What we have is a business cycle. We have an expansionary cycle where the economy is booming, or we have a contractionary cycle where the economy is slowing down. Now, if we say that 2 to 3% is ideal, so I'm using the conservative numbers, 2% and 3% is ideal, we'll call that nirvana, okay? This is where we want the economy. But we can actually get an economy that as the economy starts to pick up, we actually get a lower unemployment rate in the economy, But as we get a lower rate of unemployment, more people have jobs, they go out and consume, driving the prices up. Now this will happen on this graph in the short run. But now what can happen is we get into a contractionary cycle, which we've been in. We've lived this. We've felt it recently in this Great Recession. Here's what happens in a contractionary cycle. The demand in the economy, this is aggregate demand, total demand in the economy, starts to shift to the left as we go into this contractionary cycle, and this is the worst that the economy got to. This was 2009. This is where the U.S. economy was. We had 10% unemployment and inflation rate of 0. But now I got some good news on the horizon for you. Here is what has happened since the depths of this Great Recession. Aggregate demand, we are now in an expansionary cycle. And just so you know where we are roughly on this graph, we are about at this point in our expansionary cycle. Now, what this means is this. We currently have a 7% unemployment rate and inflation, and this is old data from yesterday. The inflation rate currently is 0.96%. In other words, it's 1%. So as this economy starts to pick up, as it is, you may see this beginning to happen. As the economy starts to pick up, and we continue in this expansionary cycle, you can tell that unemployment is going to go down, but that will start to drive prices up. Now this is ceteris paribus, all other things held constant. So now, if I look at this, if you look at this graph here, this is where we are currently, everybody. We are at 7% and 1%. Now, this is only if the economy is driven on the demand side. So all I've looked at is demand in the economy. 7%, 1%. If aggregate demand keeps picking up, here's what you can expect to happen. Ceteris paribus, all other things held constant. Unemployment rate will start to go down. Prices will start to drive up. But if you recall from that graph that I told you just a few minutes ago, where we see unemployment going down and inflation going down, let me tell you one last thing that I see happening in the economy. That not only are we seeing this start to pick up, that you're seeing we're at 7% unemployment, economy's starting to pick up, but at the same time, as world economies start to pick up also, they're going to demand more goods and services from us. So what will happen on the supply side is, and please watch what happens to unemployment and what happens to inflation. We'll supply the world more goods and services, and this is why you're starting to see a possible decrease in unemployment and a decrease in inflation. If you have any questions about, about this talk that I gave, you can always go to reffonomics.com. Now, I wrote a textbook through a grant from the Thomas R. Brown Foundation a decade ago. I started on it, an internet textbook. And it's free, quote unquote. It's not obviously free because I spent a decade of my life writing it. But I gave it to my students for nothing. Didn't charge them a dime. Because I really believe if this economy is going to move forward, we must begin reducing the cost of college education. Because if we can reduce the cost of college education, what we will begin to see is not only aggregate demand shifting to the right, but aggregate supply also shifting to the right. We get two curves shifting in the same direction. Thank you very much for being a wonderful audience.